Welcome to my channel Spooky Stories. I've always been fascinated by places that time seems to forget. Driving through Arizona, I realized some towns weren't just abandoned. They were alive with memories of the people who once lived there. The wind whispers through broken windows. Rusted mining tools tell stories of hard work, and every cracked foundation holds a fragment of someone's life. Visiting these ghost towns made me feel a strange mix of awe and sadness, imagining families, miners, and travelers who once walked these streets. Join me as I explore 10 abandoned places in Arizona, where the past still lingers, waiting to be remembered. If you're enjoying this journey through Arizona's abandoned places, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss any of our next adventures. 1 Vulture City Ghost Town, Wickenburg, Arizona. I still remember the first time I drove toward Vulture City Ghost Town on a dry Arizona afternoon. The road felt like it stretched forever, cutting through miles of silent desert. Even before I reached the entrance, I could see the old wooden structures standing against the empty landscape, like they had been waiting for someone to return. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or legends that day, only history. Real history. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt strange, not scary, just heavier. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was the idea that thousands of miners once walked here, lived here, and worked themselves to the bone for gold that barely lasted in their hands. As I walked toward the old assay office, the smell of dust and dry would hit me. It reminded me of abandoned houses from my childhood village, quiet, untouched, but full of stories. Inside the abandoned bunkhouse, my shoes crunched over old dirt. The room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. I could almost picture the miners sitting here after a long day, talking loudly, laughing, complaining about the heat, probably thinking about home. It's strange how a place with no people can still carry their emotions. The part that hit me hardest was the hanging frame near the old gallows area. I had read the history. Vulture City really did hang criminals here. Standing in front of that wooden beam, knowing real men took their last breath there, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't supernatural. It was the weight of real lives and real endings. Before leaving, I stood quietly near the mine shaft. The wind moved across the desert, pushing warm air toward me. For a moment, it honestly felt like the place wanted to be remembered, not feared, remembered. Driving away, I kept thinking about how strange it is that a town once full of noise, work, and life can turn into silence, yet still make you feel like you're not alone. 2 Ruby Ghost Town, Santa Cruz County, Arizona. The first time I visited Ruby Ghost Town, I didn't expect the silence to hit me so hard. The drive itself felt like I was slowly leaving the modern world behind. The road turned narrower, the desert wider, and by the time Ruby's rusted gate appeared, it felt like I had stepped into a different century. I had read its history, how Ruby was once alive with miners, families, and children running between the wooden houses, but standing there made those facts feel heavier, more personal. When I walked onto the old dirt streets, the wind moved through the empty school building as if it still remembered the voices of the kids who once sat inside. I pushed the door open, and the faint smell of old wood and dust came out. The classroom was empty, of course, but I found myself imagining a teacher writing on the board, kids whispering, the usual chaos of a small mining town. It felt strange how quickly my mind filled the silence with real people who once existed. Across from the school was the jail, small, cramped, and painfully real. I stepped inside and felt a sudden shift in my chest. Maybe it was the coldness of the metal bars or the thought of those 3 tragic murders Ruby is historically known for. This wasn't a ghost story, this was history. People really lived through fear here. The stories weren't myths. They were police records. As I moved toward the abandoned mercantile store, I noticed old cans, broken glass, and shelves that hadn't been touched for decades. I stood there imagining families buying flour or tools, not knowing their town would one day fall apart and be swallowed by dust. Before leaving, I stopped near the lake, calm, peaceful, reflecting the mountains like nothing bad ever happened here. And that's what struck me the most. Ruby is quiet now, but every corner holds the weight of real lives, real struggles, and a real town that didn't survive. Walking away, I felt like I had stepped out of someone else's memories, carrying a piece of their story with me. 3 Two Guns Ghost Town, Flagstaff, Arizona. I still remember the first time I pulled over near Two Guns Ghost Town on Route 66. The highway noise slowly faded behind me, and ahead was nothing but broken stone buildings, cracked asphalt, and open desert stretching for miles. I had seen pictures online, but standing there in person felt completely different. Two Guns wasn't just abandoned. It felt like the desert had swallowed it slowly, piece by piece. Walking toward the old trading post, I could still read some faded paint on the walls. It reminded me that this place once served travelers, families, and road trippers crossing Route 66. Inside, the air smelled like dust and sun-baked stone. I imagined people stepping in for supplies, maybe laughing, maybe arguing, never imagining that one day the roof would fall and the windows would disappear. Just a little farther, I reached the remnants of the roadside zoo. The cage is still there, rusted and half buried in sand. Knowing the history, I couldn't help but think about the animals that once lived here. Lions, wolves, cougars. Real animals trapped in these tiny enclosures, attracting tourists. It felt strange standing there, listening to nothing but the wind where once there had been roars and crowds. Then I walked toward the famous Apache Death Cave entrance. It's a real historical site, tragic and heavy. Standing near the opening, I didn't feel fear. I felt something closer to respect. The story of what happened here isn't a myth. It's a recorded part of Arizona's past. As I looked into the dark opening, the temperature dropped slightly, and for a moment I just stood there thinking about how history isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's painful. The last thing I saw before leaving was an old concrete bridge, cracked and abandoned, stretching over a dry wash. It looked fragile, like it had been holding its breath for decades. As I walked back to my car, I turned around one more time. Two Guns didn't feel haunted, it felt forgotten. And somehow, that felt even heavier. 4. Jerome Abandoned Mine Tunnel, Jerome, Arizona. The first time I visited Jerome and stepped near the old mine tunnels, I felt something I hadn't expected, an odd mix of curiosity and respect. Jerome is still a living town, but the deeper you go toward the old mining sections, the more you feel how much history is buried underneath your feet. I wasn't thinking about ghosts that day. I was thinking about the thousands of miners who worked here, real people whose lives depended on these tunnels. As I walked down the gravel path leading toward one of the sealed entrances, the wind carried a smell of old timber and rust. The wooden beams around the tunnel mouth were weathered and cracked, but they still stood like tired shoulders holding up the past. I placed my hand on one of the beams, and it felt rough, almost brittle. For a moment, I imagined what it must have felt like for miners heading into the darkness every morning, knowing the walls could collapse at any time. Jerome wasn't an easy place to survive back then. The town literally sits on unstable ground. I had read that some buildings actually slid downhill over the years because the mines underneath weakened the earth. Standing there, I could understand why. The entire hillside felt like it had stories hidden beneath it. I walked a little farther and reached a fenced-off shaft. Peering inside, I felt a cold wave push out from the darkness. It wasn't fear, it was the realization of how deep the tunnels went. Miles and miles underground, carved by men who had nothing but lanterns and hope. I imagined the noise of drills, the shouting, the echo of metal hitting stone. All of it gone now, replaced by silence so complete it almost rang in my ears. Before leaving, I stood at the edge of the hill overlooking the town. Modern houses, cars, restaurants, they all looked so light compared to the heavy history below them. As I walked back, I kept thinking how strange it is that a place once full of danger, sweat, and life can now sit quietly, as if exhaling after a century of hard work. 5 Canyon Diablo Ghost Town, Coconino County, Arizona. The first time I drove toward the remains of Canyon Diablo, I didn't know what to expect. There's no proper entrance, no visitor center, no crowds, just open land, endless wind, and a few scattered ruins that once made up one of the roughest towns in Arizona's history. When I stepped out of the car, the silence felt almost dramatic, like the land was daring me to imagine what this place had once been. Canyon Diablo wasn't like other ghost towns. It was known for its violence, its lawlessness, and for having almost no rules. Standing on the cracked ground, I tried to picture the old saloons, gambling halls, and makeshift buildings that once stood here. All that remains now are piles of stones, broken foundations, and fragments of walls. But even those small pieces felt heavy with the past. Walking toward the old railroad area, I stopped where the bridge was supposed to be. The canyon dropped sharply below me, and I could imagine how dangerous it must have been during the railroad construction days. The workers who came here faced harsh weather, unstable ground, and constant tension from the town's outlaws. It wasn't a dramatic story, just real life in a brutal place. I picked up a small rusted metal piece near the ground, maybe part of an old tool or building. Holding it in my hand, I thought about the people who once lived here. Miners, workers, travelers, people who probably hoped this town would grow into something bigger. Instead, it collapsed into violence and was abandoned faster than anyone expected. As I walked back toward my car, the wind cut across the empty land, carrying the dry desert smell with it. There were no buildings left to block the sound, no voices, nothing man-made except a few ruins. For a moment, it felt like Canyon Diablo wasn't just abandoned, it was erased. Driving away, I kept thinking about how a place once filled with noise, arguments, and danger could now be so quiet that you can hear your own heartbeat. Canyon Diablo didn't scare me. It just reminded me how quickly history can disappear when no one is left to protect it. 6 Gold King Mansion, Mojave County, Arizona. The drive to Gold King Mansion felt like traveling deeper and deeper into a forgotten part of Arizona. The dirt road was long and rough, and every mile made me wonder how workers once traveled this same route every day. When the mansion finally appeared in the distance, standing alone in the middle of the desert hills, I had to stop for a moment. It didn't look like a mansion the way we imagine one today. It looked like a stone skeleton, strong, quiet, and surviving because it refused to fall. As I walked closer, the first thing I noticed was how solid the walls still were. Built in the 1920s for the Gold King mine managers, this place wasn't made for beauty, it was made to last. When I touched the stone, it felt cool even under the hot sun. I imagined the workers sitting inside these rooms, planning mining operations, talking about gold production, maybe even dreaming about a future that never came. Inside, the rooms were open to the sky. No roof, just bright sunlight pouring in. I stood in what used to be the main hall and tried to picture it full of furniture, maps, tools, maybe even small celebrations when the mine had a good week. Now, just shadows moved across the walls. But those walls felt alive with memory. One moment that stayed with me was standing at the window frame overlooking the desert. The view was endless: mountains, sand, quiet wind. I realized how isolated the workers must have felt. This wasn't an easy place to live. It was harsh, demanding, and unforgiving. Yet they stayed because the promise of gold was stronger than the discomfort. Before leaving, I walked around the outside one last time. The air smelled like dry earth and old stone, and there was something strangely peaceful about it. As I got into my car and looked back, the mansion stood there the same way it had for a century, weathered, abandoned, but still holding its ground like a silent witness to the lives that once filled it. 7 Swansea Ghost Town, La Paz County, Arizona. Reaching Swansea Ghost Town felt like driving into a place the desert had been trying to hide for decades. The dirt road was long and isolated, and every mile made the world around me feel quieter. When the first ruins appeared, broken walls, rusted metal, and scattered foundations, I stopped the car and stepped out into a silence so strong it almost felt heavy. Swansea wasn't a violent town or a dramatic one. It was simply a hard-working mining community that slowly died after the price of copper collapsed. Walking among the ruins, I realized that its quiet ending made it feel even more human. No explosions, no disasters, just a town that faded because life became too hard to continue. The first building I walked toward was the old smelter area. Large concrete structures still stood, cracked but solid, surrounded by rusted metal equipment. I placed my hand on one of the concrete walls. It was warm from the sun, but the texture felt rough, almost like the years had carved their story into it. I imagined workers standing right where I was, tired from long shifts, wiping sweat from their foreheads as the smelter roared beside them. Farther ahead were the remains of the company's store and the workers' houses. Small, simple foundations, nothing luxurious, nothing fancy, just enough to live in while trying to build a future. As I walked between them, I couldn't help thinking about the families who lived here. Kids running across the desert ground, mothers carrying water, men leaving early for the mines. Ordinary lives in an extraordinary landscape. The moment that stayed with me happened when I reached an old metal water tank lying on its side. The wind pushed against it, making a low, hollow sound that echoed through the empty town. It felt like the last heartbeat of Swansea. Before I left, I stood on a small rise, looking out over the scattered ruins. The desert stretched endlessly around them, quiet and indifferent. Driving away, I realized Swansea wasn't just abandoned. It was a reminder of how quickly a community can disappear when the world changes faster than people can keep up. 8 Stanton Ghost Town, Yavapai County, Arizona. The first time I visited Stanton Ghost Town, I arrived with almost no expectations. The road leading in was quiet, lined with desert brush and old wooden fences that looked like they had survived far more years than they should have. When the first historic buildings appeared, standing under the wide Arizona sky, I felt like I had stepped into a place where time had paused instead of passing. Stanton wasn't always a ghost town. In the late 1800s, it was a gold camp, loud, chaotic, and packed with people chasing opportunity. As I walked past the preserved structures, I tried to imagine that noise. Men shouting across the street, horses kicking up dust, the constant rhythm of tools hitting rock. But now, all I could hear was the wind brushing past the old boards. I approached the main building, the one with weathered wooden siding and a porch that still held its shape. When I put my hand on the railing, the wood felt dry and sun-baked, but solid. I thought about the miners who climbed these same steps after long days in the heat, hoping, maybe praying, that the gold they found would finally change their lives. Some got lucky, most didn't. Walking farther, I reached a small open area where a few stone foundations remained. Standing there, it felt impossible not to think about the daily lives of the families who once lived here. Women cooking inside tiny cabins, children playing in the dirt, hoping their fathers would come home safely from the mines. These weren't dramatic stories, just real people trying to survive in a difficult place. The moment that hit me the hardest was when I stood facing the hills surrounding the town. The land felt untouched, but I knew underneath it were tunnels dug by men whose names history barely remembers. The desert had taken everything back. As I headed out, I kept looking over my shoulder. Stanton didn't feel like a ghost town. It felt like a chapter that ended quietly, leaving behind a place that still remembers everyone who passed through it. 9 Chloride Ghost Town, Mojave County, Arizona. The first time I arrived at Chloride Ghost Town, I felt like I had driven straight into another century. The desert stretched endlessly around me, golden sunlight bouncing off the cracked wooden buildings and rusted metal signs. I had read that Chloride is one of Arizona's oldest mining towns, famous for silver, but nothing prepared me for the quiet weight of history the place carried. It wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by its own past. I started walking along the main street, my boots crunching on the dry gravel. Every building I passed had something to tell if you just looked closely. A cabin with broken windows still had a chair inside, leaning as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. Rusted mining equipment leaned against walls, twisted and sun-bleached. I could almost imagine the men who once worked here, hammers in hand, sweat dripping down their faces under the relentless Arizona sun. They weren't famous. They weren't remembered in newspapers. But they existed, and their labor had shaped this town. One of the highlights, and also the heaviest moments, was standing in front of the old silver mines. The entrances were dark and deep, reinforced with timber, some collapsing after decades of neglect. I imagined miners heading inside before sunrise, lanterns lighting their way, the clinking of metal echoing through the narrow tunnels. It struck me that these tunnels were more than just shafts in the rock. They were lifelines. People's livelihoods, dreams, and sometimes lives depended on them. Thinking about that made the heat of the day feel heavier, more personal, as if the desert itself remembered their struggles. I wandered further, finding the murals that locals had painted years ago on the side of a building. Faded, chipped, but still striking. They told stories of a town that had its own culture, its own rhythm, even amid the harshness of the desert. I could almost hear children running past, the laughter mixing with the wind and dust. Before leaving, I stood on a small rise overlooking the town. The sunlight made the wooden structures glow, casting long shadows across the empty street. In that moment, I realized that Chloride wasn't just a ghost town. It was a monument to the real lives, the hard work, and the hopes of people who once called it home. Driving away, I carried with me the feeling that the town still remembered them, and through me, it remembered them again. 10-0 Ghost Town, Mojave County, Arizona. The first time I drove into Nothing, Arizona, I couldn't help but laugh at the name. Nothing. That's what the town is called, and standing there, it almost felt like the desert itself was joking. The road was long, empty, and dusty, cutting through miles of dry scrub and rocky hills. No stores, no people, no signs of life other than the ruins left behind. And yet, the moment I stepped out of my car, it didn't feel empty. It felt like the echoes of the past were waiting for someone to notice them. I started walking toward the small cluster of buildings that remain. There was an old gas station, its roof partially collapsed, a small general store with broken windows, and a few rusted vehicles half buried in sand. Each piece of metal and would seem to whisper stories of people who once depended on them. Families stopping here, travelers refueling, miners passing through. For a town called Nothing, it sure had a lot of history hidden in plain sight. One thing that struck me the most was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes you aware of every small sound. My footsteps, the wind through the desert brush, a lone bird in the distance. I paused in the middle of the old road, imagining miners or travelers walking here 100 years ago, maybe arguing, laughing, or simply trying to survive in this harsh, unforgiving landscape. There was no dramatic legend, no famous disasters, just ordinary people living, working, and moving on. I wandered over to the old gas pumps, their paint faded, handles rusted. It felt surreal to hold them, knowing they were once lifelines for people driving across the desert. I imagined the heat, the sun beating down on the travelers, the long hours it must have taken to keep this small town running. Everything here is simple, but every detail tells a story of determination and survival. Before leaving, I climbed a small rise to look back at the town. Nothing was left to block the view of the desert stretching endlessly behind it. And yet, for all its emptiness, nothing felt alive in memory. Driving away, I realized that the town's name didn't describe what it is, it described what it lost. But in that loss, you can still feel the presence of real people, real lives, and real stories that refuse to disappear completely.